Welcome everyone to this, the first in a series of webinars that's been arranged by the Construction Leadership Council, looking at the delivery of the Construction Playbook. My name is Alistair Reisner. I'm Chief Executive at the Civil Engineering Contractors Association and a member of the Construction Leadership Council. Today we've got a really stellar lineup of speakers, including Neil Humphrey, representing the Association of Consultancy and Engineering, Sharoz Junejo, who is from the Infrastructure and Projects Authority, Emma Jane Houghton from the New Hospitals Programme, and Ian Wright from Network Rail. Gemma, can we move on to the next slide? So, to give a little bit of a background as to how we got to here today, the Construction Playbook was published in December last year. Now, for me, it sets out the new rules of the game in terms of working for the public sector, for the construction industry. It's, to me, one of the most important documents that we've seen in recent times, as it does set us on a path to what I think will be a much better future in terms of the relationship between the industry and those public sector clients, hopefully creating more sustainability in terms of suppliers' business models, but also meaning that we're delivering much better outcomes for our customers. It was developed in partnership with industry, so it's not something that's been done to us if you're on the supply side of the industry, but something that the industry has helped the government to develop. When it was launched, the Construction Leadership Council made a commitment that we would support the rollout of the playbook to make sure that people were aware what was in it and what it would mean in terms of changes to the way work. So I could just ask if you
Alistair, you put yourself on mute.
Sorry, I just managed to mute myself there. So the Construction Leadership Council committed to support the rollout of the Construction Playbook. The first element of that was a webinar that many of you may have joined us for in January, where we did an overview of what the whole content of the playbook was. But really, the interesting stuff is getting into the detail. So there are 14 key policies within the playbook. The first of which we're talking about today, which is the development of commercial pipelines. It's something that I'm personally passionate about, and I think that the industry is passionate about in terms of creating that visibility of the forward investment pipeline that helps industry understand what's coming in terms of potential scheme to be working on. Now, just some quick ground rules about today. This is not like a normal webinar where it's very much broadcast. We do want it to be strongly interactive. The reason for that is, although we're presenting this stuff to you today, it's also going to help us to provide training support to anyone that is developing a pipeline in the future, or anyone that is working and needing to use pipelines. So to develop that, we want your views, whether you're someone who's on a client side or whether you're a supplier that looks at pipelines. So we want to know from you, what do you want from a pipeline and what do you see as some of the challenges? So when we're developing that training, we can support to make sure that it answers all the questions that you may have. We always get asked the question, will the slides be available after the meeting? Yes, we may need to do a couple of bits of editing in certain places where there's some sensitive stuff in there, but generally speaking. And then after that, as I say, this is the aim to provide training. So we hope to have some e-learning modules specifically around the development of commercial pipelines. So that will follow shortly. We are going to have some Q&A at the end. So if you've got questions, as I say, I strongly encourage you to add them to the chat function. And we'll pick them up at the end. One point that I do want to make about this isn't about the content in terms of the specific schemes within the playbook. So we'll not be able to answer questions about what's happening with this job or that job. So if that's what you're after, that's probably something to deal with in another forum. If you do have questions about the pipeline itself and how it's created, that's hopefully what we're getting out of this today. So if we could move on to the next slide. So from a Civil Engineering Contractors Association's perspective, these are some of the things that we see as some of the benefits of having an effective pipeline. For a supplier, it's about being able to plan your resources to meet the market that's coming to you. So if you've got better visibility of that pipeline, it's much, much easier to understand how to plan your resources, whether that's buying plant and machinery, whether that's investing in your workforce. That pipeline helps with that process. Also, that stability, if you know what the forward pipeline looks like, you're less likely to be laying off and taking on, because you know you can manage that workforce to meet that future demand. Clearly, that visibility also gives you the ability to invest in innovation, so developing new products, new processes to deliver in the workload of the future. It helps to identify pinch points and droughts, so where we might need more resource. If you know what's coming down the line, it's much better in terms of managing that. As an industry, we know that we get better outcomes on projects where we've got that engagement prior to the market. If we can have that visibility, it allows us to have those conversations with clients before schemes to come to the market. So that's another benefit of that pipeline visibility. Similarly, it allows us to point out fairly early on where we see potential pitfalls in relation to schemes. At an industry level, it helps us with forecasting, so we can look strategically across the industry at what the levels of demand are going to be and forecast what the requirements will be at that strategic level. And certainly for shareholders, one of the things we regularly get feedback on is that visibility helps to build confidence about the future business models of organisations. And one final thing, when we look elsewhere in the playbook and the desire to move the industry to more of a platform-based approach to the delivery of construction and infrastructure work, a pipeline is essential to that. So if you don't have that pipeline, it's very difficult to invest in the creation of a platform that we can work on that basis. So if we can move on to the next slide. So from a Seeker perspective, where do we see opportunities in relation to further improving the pipelines that we see out there? Well, one is around standardization. There are lots of pipelines for individual organizations out there, but it's quite disparate in terms of the way that they're structured. So the individual pipelines, to be blunt, don't talk to each other. So if there's greater standardization of the content, there's an ability to aggregate across pipelines and do some intelligent stuff about what that means for the industry as a whole. While there is some good practice out there from some of our strategic infrastructure clients, there's less use of pipelines at local authorities and other organizations. So we would welcome expansion of the visibility of pipelines for organizations in that space. And we think that some of the work that's being done by the government and indeed with the playbook helps in that area. So in terms of returning value to clients, this goes back to that market engagement piece I talked about earlier. If we can see that pipeline, there's much better opportunities for us to work really intelligently with our clients to do proper deep market engagement, talking about risks, talking about opportunities. So we can do more with the pipelines that we have available. And also, I think there's an opportunity from the supply side around a maturity in terms of how we deal with the information. I think when we speak to clients, there's a reticence sometimes to publish information because then, well, I'll only be banged over the head about what I've published if it doesn't turn out to work out exactly as we had in the pipeline. So I think from the supply chain, it's about saying, well, how are we going to use the information but not criticize if everything doesn't go exactly as was planned? So that for me is a very quick canter through from a supply chain perspective, but we're just representing the contractors. I'd now like to pass across to Neil. Neil, are you happy to run through the perspective from a consultancy point of view?
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. Let me just share my content. Hopefully that will work. So hopefully everyone can see this. Please shout if you can't, or someone to shout if you can't. Right, so good afternoon. My name is Neil Humphrey. I am the Chief Operating Officer at Waterman Group and board member for the ACE and chair of our new pipeline and procurement initiative. Just a bit of a summary in terms of just wait for this to roll on. My slides seem to have frozen. There we go. Just a quick overview in terms of the ACE. So we represent over 450 members who jointly employ around 60,000 people in the UK and 250,000 worldwide. Pipeline and procurement, as I mentioned, is a new area for the ACE. It sits alongside other key initiatives such as net zero, places and mobility. And the primary aim of the initiative is to champion greater clarity and transparency in the government's pipeline and to support wider clients in developing their procurement strategies. So recent activity for us has been very much focused around working with the IPA on further developing the clarity in the pipeline. And as I mentioned, we're also keen to encourage clients to procure in a way that facilitates consultancy value add. We'll be shortly launching a new market sounding initiative where we hope to work with clients to explore early market engagement and develop efficient procurement in line with the Playbook's market health and capability assessments. And we've also been very active recently in trying to influence government policy across these areas. So in recent weeks, we've run a number of workshops with our members in response to the government's consultation on transforming public sector procurement. And following the publication of the Playbook, we've also been working with Professor David Mosey of King's College London on the Cabinet Office review of public sector frameworks. So consultancy is no different to any other people-based business. We're only as good as our people and the service we provide to our clients. And we need to invest in those people and their skills. And we can only do this if we've got visibility and confidence in our future workloads and the pipeline. So forward visibility in the private sector is often more difficult to predict, and will depend on the individual sector. So in general, the private sector pipeline can be measured in months as opposed to years, and with the risk that the projects may go on hold at short notice due to market sentiment or confidence in the underlying economy. So the public sector is therefore an essential counterbalance, and the Playbook recognises this with its commitment to the centralised procurement pipeline. So the publication of the National Infrastructure and Construction Pipeline in 2019, which provided the route map the sector very much needed in understanding where the focus was on investment over the medium term. And this enabled organisations to develop their strategies in these areas. And the short-term pipeline published last year built on this clarity, detailing individual projects that were planned to come to market within the next 12 to 18 months. And we've been working with the IPA to build on the next iteration of the pipeline, which will be published later this year. And I know that Sharose will be taking us through that shortly. However, we also need to recognise that this is being considered within the shadow of the pandemic and the economic recovery. And will government continue its commitment in terms of maintaining infrastructure investment and the levelling up agenda? So what do we need in terms of the pipeline? Well, accuracy of the information is fundamental. And we know that the IPA team have been working extremely hard in liaising with government departments and local authorities to ensure that the pipeline is as accurate as possible. But we also recognise that there is a balance between giving the most accurate information and as much advance warning as possible on future projects. When we consider coverage and clarity, this reflects the need to understand whether all projects of a certain type are included, the basis for a project's inclusion in the pipeline, and whether we know not only the overall value of the project, but also the value of the specific work package a consultant can bid for, its procurement route and when. And this then feeds into the timeliness of the information. And while we would appreciate that project programs can slip, the accuracy of when projects do come to market is important. And again, this is a balance, and we need to try to avoid delays in project commencement, especially once awarded, as we've had numerous members citing difficulties where they've been awarded on a framework or a project only for the start date to slip, which is especially problematic when teams have been recruited and mobilised. So good procurement in the pipeline matters. This is a really exciting time for the industry. 37 billion of spending was set out by the IPA in June last year, and the government has recognised the need to build back better, faster and greener in the wake of the pandemic, having also legislated for net zero. So the Green Paper and the Playbook recognise that the pipeline needs to be procured more efficiently. And this reflects AC's research on international benchmarking, which highlighted that consultancy costs in the UK are equivalent to the Europe, but the capital costs of projects in the UK are higher. So whilst there is a number of causes to this, procurement process and policy are a contributory factor. And recognition of the need for efficient procurement is a fundamental and positive shift. as bidding for public sector contracts can be very expensive. The CLC estimates that it costs the sector 1 billion to bid for about 15 billion that it delivers in the UK economy, which is 6 to 7%. And ACE's own benchmarking analysis indicates that bidding costs are between 4 to 5% of annual revenues. Now, when you consider that as a sector, consultancies tend to need to earn £100,000 to generate £6,000 profit, so 6% margin, and contractors need to earn in the region of 1 million to generate 30,000 of profit. It's clear that any reduction in bidding costs could be hugely welcomed and would enable reinvestment in terms of innovation and skills. It would also support the SME involvement in the public sector, which is advocated by the Playbook. And ultimately, increased efficiency will drive greater value and would support the government's ambitions for global Britain. So both the Green Paper and the Playbook recognise a shift away from cost towards value is needed. And the Green Paper advocates awards based on most advantageous tender as opposed to most economically advantageous. Now, currently, ACE members are still having sight of tenders weighted 60 to 70% on price, and concerted effort by all parties to promote a more rounded approach to what constitutes value will be needed. You get what you pay for resonates when it comes to the sector. Now, the Construction Innovation Hub's Value Toolkit explores value further, and this shift will support transformation in the consultancy sector, which the ACE considers further in its value-based business models report. And that brings us to early market engagement, which will enable much more complex challenges such as net zero to be considered earlier in the project lifecycle. It's far easier to design out embedded and operational carbon than to value engineer a client design. And this is one of the key areas we want to explore with clients this year in our market sounding initiative, so that clients can procure the best value within the market aligned to their value priorities. And finally, the pipeline will need to reflect and support the transformation the sector will witness through digital innovation. The Playbook recognises this shift in the consideration of potential delivery approaches, which will support new business models that the public sector will be able to take advantage of. For example, many of our members are already involved in delivery of schemes using modern methods of construction, and the Playbook reinforces a presumption in favour of offsite. So this will shift capability and pricing models for design consultants as a single design starts to be deployed multiple times. And gradually we will witness a shift from pure people hours based consultancy to a more blended approach where expertise is supported by data and technology. So the ACE is really encouraged in the direction of travel the government is taking it in creating greater clarity in the forward pipeline and recognising the need to reduce bid costs and procure more efficiently. But foremost in everyone's minds, however, is will the government stay true to its aspirations for future investment in infrastructure in the wake of the deficit, or will we witness a reduction in spending in the next 2 to 3 years? Thank you. I'll hand over now.
Thanks, Neil. So hopefully that gives a good overview of the views from the supply side of the industry in relation to what we would like to see from a pipeline. I'm now delighted that when we think about the pipeline in terms of the most visible version of that, it's probably the pipeline that is published by the Infrastructure and Projects Authority. So it's brilliant today to have Shiroz Junejo with us to run through the National Infrastructure and Construction Pipeline and give a bit of an overview of how it's developed and perhaps some direction of travel as to where it's going. So Shiroz, can I hand over to you?
Thanks, Alistair. No pressure there, Ed. So thanks all for having me. By way of introduction, my name's Shiroz Junejo. I head up the Major Infrastructure Tracking Unit of the IPA, and I've been producing this particular pipeline for going on half a decade now, actually. If we move to the next slide, I just want to start off by going into how this document's really evolved. The pipeline publication that the IPA does actually came out of a document known as the 2010 Infrastructure Cost Review, which found a number of facets of how the UK government procures works that could be improved in order to streamline delivery. And one of those things was a forward-looking pipeline. Now, over the past decade, that pipeline has evolved, going from looking purely at economic infrastructure to economic and social to public and private including things such as regional analysis, projections, what have you. And to maintain that momentum, following the publication in 2020, we worked with industry to understand what would be the most impactful and beneficial pipeline for yourselves. And what conclusion we came to was that actually we want to provide a tool that allows you to look at the strategic as well as the tactical. And with that in mind, what we are going to do for the next iteration of the document is provide you with a forward view of investment across projects and programs, across infrastructure and construction, across central government, private sector organizations where they work with us, as well as local government, so that that can inform your business strategies and so that you can understand where is the investment going over the next 5 to 10 years. The secondary thing we will do is the tactical, and that's specifically looking at what information do you need in order to inform your business planning for the next 12 to 18 months. And with that in mind, we will be incorporating the procurement pipeline from 2020 into this document so that that is also included alongside the investment information. So for the first time, what you'll be getting is both a forward view of investments and where those investments are translating into new work packages over the next 18 months. Now, if we move to the next slide, what I wanted to do was just provide you with the key principles that we will look to adhere to when we develop this document. Now, one of the things that we are looking to do is to capture all stakeholders as far as we can. 2020 was actually quite unique in the sense that we were able to galvanize central government, local government, indeed the devolved administration, and quite a number of private sector stakeholders to feed into the pipeline. And it's very much our intent to utilize those relationships that we've built over 2020 to make sure that we are including as many stakeholders as possible once again. The second thing that we have decided to do is not exclude on the basis of buying power. Now, those of you that might be familiar with the pipeline publication may be aware that previous iterations, certainly prior to the 2020 iteration, included projects and programs with a minimum investment of £50 million. We've come to the conclusion that actually that de minimis threshold is too high, and we have chosen not to use that as the current level of investment. We're reducing that because what we want to do is to provide an overview of opportunities, not just for strategic suppliers, but SME and firms further down the supply chain as well. Now, the third bullet point is quite important, and it certainly plays to the point that Neil was alluding to earlier, which is around certainty. Ultimately, we produce this document because we want to provide as transparent and as realistic a view of future investment and delivery to industry as possible. We want you to succeed, and we want you to invest in the things that will help you deliver these schemes in a way that benefits both us as the client and yourself as the contractor. And for this reason, one of the key elements to this document is certainty. So when we include projects, programs, investments, procurements within this pipeline, the primary criteria is that we need to have a high delivery confidence, that it will invest you, that it will procure to the timelines that are being published in the document. And indeed, that is something that is implicit by the fact that it is actually being published. The final thing that we want to do is set the long-term trajectory. Now, as many of you have alluded to, the NIS and the Playbook have set out quite an ambitious package, both in what should be delivered and how it should be delivered. And we want to utilize this document to translate those policies into projects and programs on the ground and show you what it is that we are investing in to actually make those things happen. Now, if we go into the next slide, this provides you with an overview of what the strategic element of the pipeline would look like. Now, this is based off the 2018 publication, and it showed investment for the remainder of the SR period. As you may be aware, there were a number of multi-year exceptions that were agreed during the spending review process in 2020, and we will in fact be looking to provide you with a 5-year view of future investment across projects and programs, across departments, across private sector, including the key sectors, which is transport, energy, utilities, social infrastructure, digital, science and research, and flood and coastal erosion. Now, obviously, within the analysis document that accompanies the pipeline, we provide overarching summaries. However, when you actually go into the document itself that is out in the public domain with this analysis document, you can find the exact details of all the projects and programs that are making up these investments and how much they're investing in a year. The other thing that we will do, if we move to the next slide, is continue to demonstrate the government's leveling up agenda, as well as the overarching investment profile over the next decade. Because we want to provide as much transparency as possible. What we will be doing that we haven't done in the past is conducting the regional analysis on all projects and programs that are included within this pipeline in terms of investments, and actually within the spreadsheet setting out how much in each ONS region, each one of these projects and programs will actually be investing. If you were to look at the 2018 document, you'll find that in the case of transport, we actually set out investment per region across each transport scheme. So we're taking it to the next step, and instead of just doing that for transport, within the core sheet, we will actually set out how much each project is actually investing, as well as setting out the overarching regional analysis to demonstrate the investment per capita across each ONS region, both public and private. If we move on to the next slide. Now, in order to incorporate this, these are some of the changes that we're making to this strategic pipeline in terms of investments. We're lowering the de minimis threshold to £15 million for all schemes that are social infrastructure and for projects that are funded by local government in order to try and pick up more of the opportunities that would be available to SMEs or smaller contractors. Similarly, in the case of economic infrastructure, we are also lowering the threshold so that we are now looking at schemes that are £30 million in value or greater. In addition to that, we also have been working with organizations such as the Department for International Trade and have been engaging with a number of firms in the private finance space and have agreed to include an additional column that sets out where there is an opportunity for private finance on a specific project or program. Again, this is to help organizations such as DIT achieve their inward investment targets, as well as providing that opportunity to private sector enterprises that have expressed an interest in being able to understand where they can invest. We will also be including an indicator for MMC. Now, this is really the first step in what essentially should be a more detailed indicator. We are starting with assessing where projects and programs will be substantially using MMC, and this accounts for anything ranging from digital design to offsite or volumetric construction to give an indication of how much investment government is putting forward and how much it is seeking to leverage that investment to actually adopt more MMC. Additional changes that we will be including, in addition to the regional investment that I alluded to before and the planned and projected element, is something that has been referenced a few times already in this discussion, and that is workforce. So one of the new additions, in line with what was the NIP for skills that was published by the IPA's predecessor in 2013, is going to be a forecast based off the investments included in the pipeline of the workforce requirement to deliver that pipeline. Now, if we move to the next slide, this is touching on the planned and projected element for a moment, and then I'll go back to workforce. In terms of the pipeline, some of you might have heard a £600 billion over the next decade number, which was the figure that was in the 2018 document. Now, obviously, a lot of government investment is subject to spending rounds. And for this reason, we included the planned projected number in order to ensure that industry is aware that investment doesn't just stop. Yes, there might be a perceived cliff edge, but there is a certain level of capital investment that we know is going to continue, and it is simply down to another spending review taking place for that investment to actually be allocated. Now, previously, the IPA has set out the overarching figure, but what we will do for this iteration is add another level of transparency. So when we do set out the next decade of investment, we will be specifically earmarking where that investment is currently planned, i.e. known, as well as the projected element of that investment, the one that we believe is subject to spending review bids through the next SR. Now, if we move to the next slide, this is an example of some internal work that we did in the past, looking at potential future scenarios of investment, both public and private, and the overarching workforce profile required to deliver that. Now, what we are intending to do here is, for that planned investment that will be included in this next iteration of the pipeline, we will be setting out how many individuals will be required and what job opportunities will be arising as a result of the investment that the government and indeed industry is bringing forward. The idea here is to go that next level so that you have that understanding of not only the investment that we are bringing forward, but how many people we think you might need in order to fully deliver that investment as well. If we move on to the next slide, now we move on to what we've deemed the tactical pipeline. By tactical pipeline, we mean the procurement pipeline. What we did last year was essentially set out all the procurements that were linked to infrastructure construction in the built environment across economic, utilities, social, and defense. And we also provided a breakdown in line with CPV codes to set out what specific types of work were available. Everything ranging from design to design and build to consultancy services to actually building the asset in question, so construction works, building and civils. And we'll continue to do that for this iteration and provide an 18-month view. If we move on to the next slide. However, we are making some changes. Now, again, the de minimis threshold is something that we have discussed quite a bit. And indeed, in terms of the procurement pipeline, that being the first one that we'd ever done, there was quite a bit of healthy feedback that we did get from externals. And as a result of that, there are a number of changes that we're making to this document. We're lowering the de minimis thresholds again so that we can capture more opportunities that would be open not just to strategic suppliers, but to SMEs. We are explicitly going to set out where the opportunity type is a consulting or contracting opportunity. Indeed, a lot of people flagged last year that it was very difficult to know if an opportunity within the pipeline was a legitimate opportunity, because oftentimes a contracting authority might actually procure something via a framework. So in addition to explaining the route to market as we did before, we will explicitly state whether a contract is via an existing framework or not. And where that is, we will be setting out the name of the framework. And again, we'll be putting out a demarcation for where a specific contract is expected to utilize a substantial amount of MMC. Again, this is MMC in all senses, so it can range from anything from digital design to offsite or volumetric, but it is a clear indication that that contract is expected to utilize some form of new tech to assist in its delivery. I believe that is pretty much everything from me at that point. So happy to move on to the next presenter.
Well, thank you very much, Sharoz, for running through that. That gives a good overview of how you're putting together the sort of from the center, that overarching pipeline, which I think is really helpful, because that's certainly from our perspective, it does give much better visibility to industry of sort of the strategic view of the future. I'd now like to move on, because in essence, the whole emphasis of this session today is to support individual customers as they seek to develop their own pipelines to make sure it's aligned with best practice. So I'm delighted that today we've got two of the industry's leading clients who've agreed to take part in the session. I'll introduce them in a second, but before we get onto there, I can see a few of you are adding comments in the sidebar. In essence, the price of participation in these events is participation, so please do put your comments in the chat. It'll help us when we're doing some of the subsequent activity in relation to this. But that's enough waffle from me. It's brilliant to have Emma Jane Houghton here today to talk about the new hospitals programme and how they're going to be dealing with their pipeline. I would just remind you, this is not an opportunity to ask questions about the programme itself. There will be other chances to do that, but this is really about how Emma Jane and her team are putting together the pipeline. So Emma Jane, can I pass across to you?
Oh, many thanks, Alistair. And good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here, have the opportunity to talk to the contractor market, to listen to the contractor market. That's most definitely what I'm here for. I'll just do a bit of an intro before I ask the team to sort of drive the few slides that I've pulled together today. So some context would be that I am new in role. This is in the context of big programs, this is a fairly new program. I've been in place for 8 weeks. Before that, for people that don't know me, I was the commercial director for the Heathrow expansion project. And before that, I was with KPMG for 5 years as a director in their infrastructure advisory group. And then before that, I've sort of delivered a number of different commercial roles, both pre and post contract in the rail sector, in aviation, in water and wastewater. And the amalgamation of all of that experience has been to sort of specialise in a commercial role, a commercial philosophy that really concentrates on driving the productivity of our industry, of our sector, and that puts value, procuring for value, at the heart of what we do. And that's very much what I intend to do here. So I thought that was important to set that out as a philosophical point. As I say, I'm 8 weeks in, and as I'm sure you can imagine, I'm still really finding my feet. But I will start the market engagement for New Hospitals programme in earnest, and actually this probably today is the first one of those where I will go out and start to talk to the market about what we're thinking, about what we're doing, about what we're developing, and to also really listen about what the market needs from us in order to create the market that we need. It'll be no secret actually that the market for this programme is at the moment very weak. It's very weak even if we were to deliver in a traditional sense of a hospital, not least because of the volume of the pipeline that we will pull together, but also because of the complex mix of benefits at the heart of this investment from Treasury, which will warrant new pockets of the market to be developed around technologies in MMC, around manufacturing capability in MMC, around a broader objective. So not only do I recognise that the commercial philosophy needs to be right, but I'm also very conscious that to create the market that I'm going to need in order to deliver the programme, we're going to need to build a pipeline and listen to how that will work. Okay, next slide, please. So the New Hospital programme, for those that don't know, is a part of Project Speed. So faster, greener, better, for those that don't know about that, that's definitely worth having a look at. And Build Back Better, which will be linked to the new budgetary controls that were put forward. It's worth sort of getting fluent in some of that language, because that's at the heart of how this programme will be governed and run as it moves through the various spending reviews. And it's also worth noting that it's part of the government's major project portfolio, which gives it special status in government. It has a rich suite of programme benefits that are targeted. As you would imagine, this is around a broad range of health outcomes, but it is also very much not just in what is delivered, but in how that is delivered. MMC features very heavily in the programme benefits in terms of what we are here to do, linked to productivity, net zero carbon, digitalisation and design standardisation, as well as the centralised procurement that makes that possible, are all very much at the heart of what we are here to do and how we are trying to work this out. In addition, there is a broad range of socioeconomic outcomes that are linked to the government's broader strategic priorities. So again, linking back to Build Back Better, we're thinking about things like levelling up, the skills challenge and social value. And I say this here because in thinking about the pipeline that we build, I will want to build a pipeline that enables me to unlock that mix of benefits, not just the sort of technical disciplines that get me to the built asset, if you see what I mean. And then my final point here is that the New Hospitals programme will be a very deliberate pathfinder for the construction playbook. It's a part of our determination that we must comply with construction playbook, and we want to comply with construction playbook and all its principles, to advocate a smarter way of delivering public works programmes and setting a new exemplar blueprint for delivery. So really, it'll be my job to work out how to enable that through the commercial strategy, of which a chunk will be how we build this pipeline. Next slide, please. So some of the background to the new hospital programme, and this is all publicly available information. So I'll just sort of rattle through this because this is available if people want to go off and find it. In 2019, Government's Health Infrastructure Plan was launched around the 30th of September, setting out a new approach to prioritise short-term operational and longer-term strategic capital. So within that HIP, 6 new hospitals were announced and funded, and seed funding provided to a further 21 trusts to start to develop their plans through concept through to VB2. Manifesto commitment in November 2019 was then set out, as I'm sure you would have seen, to build the 40 new hospitals with a cap date of 2030. In 2020, it was confirmed, as I've just said, that the programme would be a part of the GMPP, and the initial funding of 3.7 billion would take us through this spending review to 2025. We, as a programme, have a need to demonstrate meaningful progress across that programme by 2024 and bring together all of that truly programmatic approach that I've just talked to. And interestingly, for us here, we are a joint programme of the department and NHS, so we are dual sponsored, if you like. Next slide, please. So here, I would really like to share, this is my ambition, basically. I would really like to share with you the pipeline and get some feedback and sort of talk about how we best do this, but I don't have one at the minute. We are, at the moment, baselining the programme and working out what that looks like. But if we move on to the next slide, please. The scope that will inform that pipeline are those schemes that are available at the link that I've included below. And then finally, next slide, please. I've set out. So in terms of our ambition and challenges, some of the highlights, I'll be thinking about how to create a new market where MMC becomes the default go-to for delivery. I'll want to create time and space and permission for suppliers to incubate these complicated answers and get the innovation to set that future blueprint for delivery excellence. And that really will be at the heart of how I develop this commercial and procurement strategy to take it to market. We will want national, regional and local supplier base that is able to participate in the NHP enterprise without barriers to entry. So I want to explore and understand what that looks like so I can make that possible. We will very much be procuring for value to drive NHP benefits through the commercial response. And we will want to develop sensible risk positions that reflect the engineering and delivery complexity and the market capability capacity to work with the programme. So they're not exactly sort of pipeline areas, but I don't consider the pipeline to sort of sit on its own. It is a reflection of a broader commercial ambition. So I felt it was important to bring some elements of those overarching principles to life. So that's me. That's where we're up to. You can expect to see much more in the coming months once we've baselined in terms of market engagement. And it will be very much a market listening exercise where we'll want to understand from pockets of the market how you can work with us and what we need to do to make that happen, to build the market and the capability to tackle this enormous programme. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma-Jane. So there you've heard from an organisation that's at the beginning stages of developing that pipeline and some of the thinking that goes into that and how Emma-Jane's going to be using that to develop the market to make sure that there is the capability to deliver the new hospitals programme. Our next presenter is sort of at the other end of the spectrum. Is when I think about who does well in terms of a commercial pipeline and has done so for a period of time. Network Rail is definitely one of those that I would go to first. So in a second, I'll hand across to Ian Wright, Senior Contract Specialist at Network Rail, to run through both how they're responding to the playbook and what that means for them in terms of pipelines. But just one final reminder, we will go into Q&A after this session. So if you've got any questions or if you've got any points, please do use the sidebar chat to make those points. And we'll come back to those after Ian. But Ian, can I now hand across to you?
Hi, good afternoon. So I'm Ian Wright, Senior Contract Specialist. I work in procurement operations in central team in Milton Keynes, and I've been on the railways for 30 years and I've been in different parts of the business, so and been on the consultancy side in the past, so I understand sort of most sides of life and the concerns and challenges that these sort of things bring. So if we can have the next slide. So I just wanted to start off by just putting into context where we see the construction playbook in Network Rail. We are completely supportive of the construction playbook, and it's a great document to drive improvement across the industry. So, and it's got buy-in at the top level. We've been through the voluminous document, and we believe we are generally aligned with the principles. And as has been said earlier, we've got the 14 policies, and that's policy level. We feel we're fairly aligned and compliant. And there's a number of themes that go through the whole playbook, and there's the 48 key points that are brought out across the document that are highlighted as being important. And generally we are compliant. But we do recognise that all organisations are going to have areas where they have their weaknesses, and there are things we're going to be doing, and there are things where we have already started initiatives, and hopefully we'll get some fairly quick wins, and some things will take a lot longer, particularly in the digital world and the carbon. It's going to be an ongoing process. Next, please. So when the playbook was published in December, we worked through it to see obviously how compliant we were, but we're now moving on to the stage of, rather than having a central look at compliance, to actually reach out to our regions and see where those variances might be. In some regions will be more advanced than others on certain areas of the playbook. So we want to understand that better. Once we got a feel for that, we can start sharing best practices, and at the same time we've already had a number of initiatives running before the playbook came out, and we'll be building on those to close any gaps that we see in implementation of the playbook. We're starting to roll it out across the company, so it's been rolled out to sort of management level to begin with, to get the message out, but over the next couple of months we're going to do a much more detailed rollout to practitioners and try and take it down to the next level of detail rather than the high level policy principles, to try and start getting some traction on making change. Next, please. So obviously today we're talking about commercial pipeline policy. So I'll just kick off with why we think it's important. Alistair touched on this earlier on from a supply chain perspective. We'll talk about what we've done already, and we did kick off the initiative on the pipeline sometime before the playbook was announced, so we have hit the ground running, but we are doing much more in the coming months, and I'll talk that through with you. Next, please. So for us, why it's important. So you talked earlier on about the reasons why obviously it's going to be important for the supply chain. One of the things that's come out is actually by having a centralized system with common measures of how to record things, it actually helps Network Rail plan as well. So the age-old problem of people doing things on spreadsheets has its inherent issues, as we all know, and having one way of doing it, centralised, published data, helps people internally to have more confidence in the data that's published. For over a year now, we've had a big push on the SME agenda of Network Rail, and hopefully the SME world will see that we're making good progress in that area. And visibility on the pipeline will obviously help drive that agenda. In the construction playbook, obviously the importance of modern methods of construction and innovation are highlighted, and having a defined workload allows a lot more focus on being able to see where any potential aggregation could be made, both internally again, and obviously give the marketplace an opportunity to come to us and propose anything where they could see some potential benefits. And I think it goes without saying, having a transparent and competitive marketplace is beneficial for everybody. Next slide. So early on in the year, we actually went out to the supply chain to see what they wanted. And we held a suppliers day in the southern region. And the top 3 issues that came out from the suppliers on that event were probably not surprising, but more details of specific projects works. So there was a lot of feedback that would have a line in the work bank which would describe something which probably meant something to the person who wrote it, but for the suppliers it didn't have enough detail to be meaningful. So we've done a lot of work trying to encourage practitioners to actually think more about what they write down, and we're making progress, and that's going to be a long journey to make sure people think about the end user rather than just their internal description. The second point that was raised was publishing details on frameworks, and particularly even getting down to the minor works. And this was touched on earlier about the issues around frameworks. And we are fully aware of the concerns of the supply chain on getting frameworks and then not getting any work and not having any commitments. And we have made a big push in the last year to try and make sure that if possible, there's always a commitment on the framework, even if it's not the complete spend that might go through it, but at least a good proportion of it to give some commitment to the suppliers. And we'll keep plugging away at that, because there's probably more room for improvement in encouraging people to make commitments. Increased visibility on the horizon. So that was been touched upon already, and I'll come on to that later on in the slides. Management buy-in. So one of the things we've found is actually it's quite a big challenge to publish a pipeline, and we haven't got a de minimis value. So we're talking about anything that we can get on our system we want to publish. And with thousands of line items, with lots of data entries for each line, that takes a lot of effort to, 1, put it in the first place, and then 2, keep it up to date. And that'll only happen if we've got management buy-in that drives it at the lower level. And we have now got that management buy-in. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a big improvement in that. This isn't a case of the centre looking at an output, checking it and challenging it. We want a lot more confidence when it comes in. We don't have to check it, that it's already been checked locally. One other change, which seems like a small thing, but I think makes a real difference, is that against each contract, we've put a real name. And there was previously just a generic mailbox, and we all know how useful or not generic mailboxes can be, depending on how quick responses are, and having a real person that can be contacted, we hope will be seen as a big step forward. And at the end of the day, procurement practitioners' role includes managing the supply chain. So having that contact, it should be part of the day job in our view. Thank you. So over the last year, I said we've had a big push in improving quality, and that's definitely coming through now, and we're seeing an improvement. Obviously, I'll come on to what needs to be done, but there has been, we believe, a big step change. We've standardised our approach and format for data entry fields. So because we use Bravo, there have been different interpretations for the many fields in there about what should go in a particular field. And when people didn't used to know that a field was going to be used to publish something, there was less likelihood of them actually making sure they understood what should go in there. So we've got over that hurdle now, and people do know what they've got to put in there. Working with the regional teams to publish longer plans. I'll come on to that in a minute in more detail. And You heard from the IPA earlier on, so we'll be engaging with them to make sure our workbank feeds into their reported systems. But we'll of course be carrying on with our own reports because we were reporting at a much lower level on our own website. Next, please. So current plans. Fairly obviously, we need to carry on challenging the practitioners to improve the quality of the information in the system, and it's rubbish in, rubbish out. So it's probably the most important thing to give people confidence that people need to spend time getting it right in the first place. We're having a drive to try and automate things. So we recognise the effort to put data in, and we need to simplify that. And we're looking at an automated system that can pick out information from other systems. So quite often dates and plans will be in Primavera and Oracle, and there are other technical solutions that we're using in some parts of the business. And we're looking to come up with a way of pulling out the data from those systems and auto-populate Bravo so that we don't have to type things in twice. And not only does that save effort, but it also reduces the risk of errors. Once we've got it in there, we can use Power BI software to report back out in whatever format we choose, and that will obviously be a big benefit. Or we can cut it into different shapes depending on who wants to see it. As with all IT systems, we're hoping it will go live in the summer, but until we start pressing buttons and testing, we can't guarantee that. But that is our current planning. Next, please. So we talked about reporting through the IPA to make sure our data aligns, and then finishing off the issues that come up a few times about balancing accuracy and publishing longer term. We've got the Cabinet offer target of 18 months, but the Playbook itself does actually talk about a 3 to 5 year timescale, and there's no right or wrong answer on this one. The reality is the further you go out, the less reliable the data will be, and for various reasons. And once you're getting 3 or 5 years out, for things which are on frameworks, which will invariably have options to extend, we won't know whether we're going to extend 3 or 5 years out. So it will have to come with a health warning. So over the coming months, we just need to decide as a business where that line is, but definitely for the 18 months target, and looking to extend that as much as is practical. Thank you very much.
Ian, thank you very much. That's absolutely fantastic. So part of the reason we put together this webinar was to talk through the practicalities of establishing and maintaining a pipeline. I think what you've given us there is a really good overview of how Network Rails approach that, which anyone who's doing this for the first time could draw a lot of learning from. Can I ask all of our speakers just to come back onto video, and we will go into the Q&A. I've got a few things I've been picking up from the chat as we go through, but there's a couple have just come in that relate to not something that's a bit related to pipelines, but not directly on pipelines, around frameworks and zero value frameworks. As I say, it's not really pipeline stuff, but just in terms of positives on that, there's currently a live review by Professor David Mosey on the use of construction frameworks, and exactly the points that you've both raised there in relation to that about zero value frameworks, we are picking up. So as I say, it's not very pipeline, but don't worry, that is being dealt with elsewhere. If you have any questions, please do stick them in the chat. But I'll kick things off just around, as I say, this is to help people who are developing these. And I should say that's not necessarily a client level. What we also want to see is if you're a tier 1 contractor or a tier 1 consultant, your potential pipeline of opportunities for your supply chain as well. So this needn't solely apply to clients. But for those of you who are looking at developing pipelines or have done so, what do you see as the biggest challenges? What makes this difficult? So we can start thinking about the solutions. So I'm going to pick on someone, Ian. Given the author furthest down the route, you've probably got the best experience on this. What do you think the big challenges are in terms of doing the work that you've done to get to this point?
It's the volume, actually, because we're such a large client. There's people see all the big sexy projects, but below that there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of minor works jobs, which will be important to SMEs. And every time we put a project in, it's got a couple of dozen entries that need to go in, and so doing that every time and keeping it up to date, because things do change, is a big effort. So so the most important thing is, as I mentioned earlier on, is getting management buy-in, because we're looking to simplify and automate things, but at the end of the day, there is a lot of effort to do this. But we now recognise that it's the right thing to do and it's important, and we need to give it that effort and focus.
Lovely. And Sharose, I kind of feel like we've been on the journey with you a bit in terms of the work that you've been doing. What are you seeing as some of the challenges in relation to doing that sort of strategic level piece? Oh, Sharose, you're on mute.
Yeah, that's fine. You just missed my witty joke to start off. The volume is also a challenge for me personally. Every time, I think that's probably the thing that becomes most difficult, because as was pointed out, when you get a big spreadsheet, you think it's all easy. But as an example, just across central government, I have to convince 132 individual stakeholders. And then you double that number and you've got the local government stakeholders I have to convince. And there are multiple different sensitivities around what kind of data you're getting, where the schemes are, making sure you've got robust information, making sure that your stakeholders who are feeding into you understand that transparency is the key here, that you aren't trying to catch anyone out. So that in itself, that maintaining the momentum and just identifying and engaging with your stakeholder base, that is probably the biggest hurdle that you deal with right at the initiation stage. Obviously, from an IPA perspective, it's probably gotten easier for me over time, but it also is down to the fact that I've been doing it over and over again for so long. But maintaining that momentum can be challenging. That for me is the number one thing I would say is the hardest.
Lovely. And Emma Jane, you're sort of staring down the barrel of doing this for the first time. As you look to do it, what are you foreseeing as some of the challenges that you'll have to overcome in terms of getting that pipeline out there to industry?
Well, I mean, from a practical perspective, I'm keen sort of not to do that daft thing of starting from scratch when we've clearly got examples and experiences of having done it elsewhere. So my first protocol is to sort of think about what's worked well and what hasn't, and listen and shape it in that way. One area that I've not really got my head around yet, I mean, there's a pipeline for an existing market articulated in a way which is understood by an existing market, but for where we are, I need to create a new market that's going to be disrupted by new technologies and MMC. So I think the thing I'm grappling with at the moment is, how do I shape a pipeline for a shape of a market which I don't yet understand and which doesn't yet exist, if you see what I mean?
Absolutely, and that's really interesting, because my next question was going to be, there's been a few comments in the chat about, in essence, how we manage sort of signposting things like digital, like whole life value, like modern methods of construction in a pipeline. So I don't know, Sharose, obviously you've been doing a bit of thinking about this in terms of what you do. So you're talking about signposting MMC. Digital and whole life value, I think the Playbook speaks to a bit about this as well. But I suppose from your perspective, what are your thoughts about that, and how can that best be achieved?
So it's quite easy, isn't it? But it's easy to answer. It's very difficult to implement. And it's something that we've been around quite a bit. It's referenced in the Playbook, and that's looking at outcomes. And it's looking at specifically what you are trying to achieve through the scheme. And I think we ultimately do want to get to a position where we can be more granular about what kind of tech we are using and where it should be implemented. And that's kind of my end goal 5 years from now, or 2 or 3 years from now, if I'm really lucky. And that's why my first port of call is to have that MMC demarcation. Similarly, we've done exercises in the past to understand, how would we look at carbon footprint or whole life carbon of the asset? How could we potentially look at further information on the project in terms of, how productive is it? What is the value add that we're getting or generating from each scheme? These are things that I think we need to slowly move towards, which is not just looking at what's going into the project, but also ultimately start to look at what's coming out of the project and then monitor how schemes delivered in different ways will realize those outputs. That's how I would start it. I think we're early on in that stage, to be honest with you. But then again, I'm also quite cynical.
Excellent. Ian, you talked about management buy-in, and you said that was sort of one of the challenges, but how do you secure that? Because I think for people that are doing this the first time, that actually getting people on board with this, because I think Shiroz has talked about having lots of stakeholders as well. And so both the stakeholder and management buy-in, how do you make that effective? Because I think without that, you're starting off on a very tricky wicket to try and get anything, because you'll face immediate resistance. So from a Network Rail perspective, how did you secure that management buy-in?
I think it was really explained to people why it's important, so that they saw that it was the right thing to do. So we've got our 5 regions basically that we need to get on board. So once you explain to people why it's important, and it's not just a manual task that the centre are asking for, it's a lot easier to drive it home. So I think the commercial directors and regional delivery directors in each region were quick to pick up that they were getting the feedback from the supply chain as well, that this was important to them. So it was a sort of open door to some degree, that no one wants extra work to get this to be as accurate as it needs to be, but they all recognise the importance of it. So it was a bit of an open door. There'll always be challenges. People will have always got the busy times, but there is a general recognition it's the right thing to do. So it was a bit of an open door.
Excellent. Now, there's a question in, or something raised in the chat about concerns in the rail industry with HS2 and the sort of the classic rail network. What do we have concerns about coverage of people? I've pointed to the rest of you to answer some questions, so I should probably answer some questions myself. I think that this is one of the reasons why having that pipeline is so important, because it helps to answer that question. So you can say we can have a reasonable level of confidence that we do have the people we require, the competencies we require, also the plant materials, all of that. And so there's been some really interesting work that's gone on in this space. They're not on the call, but I can sort of flag up the National Skills Academy for Rail and all the work that they've done in this place. They've done huge amounts of activity, because a few years ago, this was flagged up as a potential concern. And so the work was done, and that couldn't have been done without the availability of pipeline data. So Neil, I don't know, from the consultant's point of view, clearly you're almost at the front end of some of this stuff. So is that something that you're mindful of? Is it an issue that you've seen, and do you think the pipeline helps to answer some of those questions?
Oh no, I completely agree. I think having the level of information we've got now coming through the with what Shiroz is doing on the pipeline, in particular the next iteration, when we're starting to get some more information about certainty over the route to market, with the names of the framework, etc., that really does give the consultancy market the confidence it needs to then be investing in the staff and the resources and the talent to then really push forward. Because I think the skills gap is a concern, and that's going and I think the other key initiative that we've had over the last few years is the apprenticeship program.
Yeah.
And that's been a real success in terms of getting in some great people into the industry and developing their skills up into what we need. And we've got to make sure that continues as well.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to that the fact that that is actually the reason why I kind of stuck my neck out and pushed in terms of internal to government to include that skills forecast as well. We've been working in this space. You'll have seen that Project Speed includes a specific work stream on construction skills. We want to be in a position where oftentimes it's industry, it's NSAR, it's CITB, ECITB, EU, Cogen skills. As you can guess, I've spoken to all of them, and you will see them say we need more people. And what we're trying to do with this pipeline actually is be in a position where we actually say, actually, industry, it's not just them saying it. We are telling you where you are going to need more people. Please, there's not much more I can do outside of telling you, you will need these many people at this time in this place. You might want to hire them.
Excellent. So I'm just going through the questions in the chat. Ian, there's another question here for you, looking about how Network Rail is looking at asset data management from other countries. Is that something that you've had a look at all?
I've got no knowledge on what we're doing compared to other countries. We're doing a lot of work in the asset management field, and obviously driving forward with BIM. And we're now in a fairly sound place in having all the processes in place to get BIM up and running and in more embedded at a lower level. And to some degree that sort of gets back to the skill shortage, because whilst we've got BIM experts in each region now as allocated roles to drive this forward, there is a recognition that there are probably a lack of skilled people to drive it forward across more projects. Yeah, some regions are perhaps in a better place than others, but and I think the big sort of push over the next few years will be to look at not just projects, but how it relates from data from the beginning to the end, the whole life cycle of maintaining data and not having to keep repeating and inputting data in through the various stages of the life cycle of products. So from early strategies through into the construction and into the maintenance teams, who quite often get the short straw, things handed over in formats that they're not necessarily happy with. So that's a challenge, but I'm not quite sure if anyone's been out to the rest of the world to see how they do that. We've got a lot of legacy systems. I think that's one of our problems. And whilst there's the will to try and make those systems talk to each other and possibly turn some off, that is a long-term challenge, and it costs money as well, of course. That is a big issue, but we are heading in the right direction there, but there's a long way to go.
Fantastic. Sharoz, I don't know whether you've clearly looked around the world at some of the things that other people have done. Have you got any feedback on where else you've seen good practice?
I mean, I'm biased towards this, aren't I? I think there are plenty of examples where we have seen return settlements, and those have really benefited other countries to minimize their cost, maximize their output. And certainly it's not just me. If you look at the playbook, and the mechanisms within the playbook, we all understand that you need long-term certainty to incentivize investment that will then ultimately drive down costs both for yourselves and us, and then allow us to be in a position where we are delivering more. I certainly think that if you look at the Norwegian model, specifically in the rail side, I find that to be quite interesting, because they do settlements that are 10 years long, and then while they've got that 10-year settlement, they're busy figuring out what they'll be doing for the next 10 years after that. And I think actually that's proven quite beneficial for them. So for me, that's certainly one driver. I do think that we have done certain things as a UK government that are new ideas that could prove quite beneficial. And in this case, I would reference specifically the super deduction proposed by the Chancellor at the budget. Now, between us, I had no idea about this thing. So when he said that was new to me, just like everyone else. But that is something very different that I certainly haven't seen be done before. And it does expose some potential opportunities and does provide some incentives to put that money in and try and build your capacity to do more. So I would think, yes, there are things that are being done externally, but there are things we are doing now as well that should provide a long-term benefit.
Fantastic. Well, I think we've probably come to the end of the questions there. So it remains only for me to thank everyone for your involvement today, both our speakers, and I think we've got a really good range of views and some real insight that will help anyone that's sort of going through this for the first time. But also to thank to everyone that's taken part in the chat or even just been involved in the as being part of the audience for today. As I say, this is part of a series of these events, so we will be sending out further details. There's an event on digital that'll be coming up towards the end of this month. If you haven't had details, please do just respond to the organisers of this session, and we'll send out full details. But thank you all very much for your time. And if you do have any questions, as I say, just come back via the organisation. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon and enjoy your weekend indeed.